Back in the 80s, there was a college professor, and he decided he wanted to do some research on reading comprehension skills. So he was in Virginia, in the Virginia area. He went over to Richmond Community College and the University of Virginia, and he ran all these tests with students, and he would have them read different kinds of readings, and then they would look at their comprehension ability. And he found something really fascinating. What he realized was that in both schools, the students could pick apart words and they could read through them, right? And when it came to a topic that was interesting to them or that had, you know, kind of a college student-y type of thing, dorms or cars or something, that they really did equally well in comprehending what they were reading. But when it came to anything historical or more difficult or some kind of different context was needed, what he found was that the one group of students' comprehension level broke down really quickly. They couldn't read passages like Lee's surrender to Grant. And so as he picked this apart, he realized that the problem was that these students had no context. They had no reference point. That the real problem didn't have anything to do with reading skills, because that had been actually done well. It had to do with the level of information they came into the reading with, the amount of actual knowledge base that they had to give some kind of meaning and essence to what it was that they were reading so that they could comprehend it and break it down and answer questions on it. This kind of goes back to what Wendy was talking about, how you can just Google it. Well, that's not actually the case. They couldn't perform in these tests. So this is a man you've probably heard of. His name is Edie Hirsch. And he went home in 1986 and founded the Core Knowledge Foundation. And then he went on to write Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. And especially for an educational book, it was a phenomenon. It stayed on the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list, for 6 months. So it was very widely read. And basically, what he was saying is, we're losing our culture. These students are kind of, in his mind, what he was angry about is that he wanted the less advantaged students to have better opportunities. And he was equating their knowledge base with the fact that they were staying in the poor class generation after generation after generation. He felt like that they couldn't comprehend well enough to do well enough in college to break out or even to get into college or whatever it was. And so his whole mission was, let's break this cycle, let's help these students, let's give them the core knowledge. Let's go back to all the really great stuff that students used to study that has been taken out over the last, progressively over the last century, especially last half of the century. And what's fascinating about Hirsch is that he was always kind of just a flaming liberal. I mean, politically, very, very liberal. But when he came out with the idea of cultural literacy, it was all of the conservatives that were super happy about it. William Bennett gave a huge endorsement for it. And he was happy about that it got traction, but it didn't reach many of his peers that he hoped to reach on the liberal end of the spectrum. And because those individuals were upset that they thought Hirsch was saying that these kids should read great books. So I think that's fascinating anyway. Why shouldn't they read great books? But the point is, so he finally just came out and said it. He said, I've been attacked by some liberals on the assumption that I must be advocating a list of great books that every child should read. But really, in the end, he became a traditionalist. He says that he realized that only the traditional model was going to really give kids the core knowledge that they needed to be able to thrive. I mean, just think, for example, about Shakespeare references. I mean, if you've read probably his dozen most popular plays, it's everywhere. It's amazing how it's everywhere. And if you have no reference point, you don't ever get it, right? So you're left out of the conversation. Hirsch was saying that our educational systems are built on Dewey, which they are. Dewey's mostly built on Rousseau, which pretty much is. And basically, Rousseau was a naturalist. He said, you know, let's not worry about information. Let's just let the child roam. I mean, Rousseau doesn't even want any education to happen before 12 of any kind. And so he says, Hirsch says, only by piling up specific communally shared information can children learn to participate in complex cooperative activities with other members of their community. So only when there's some basis of shared knowledge can you really call yourselves a community and communicate with each other, right? And so this is a phenomenal idea. This is a great idea. This in fact, is really a true principle. I think everyone in the room could agree that there should be some kind of common core knowledge. There should be some kind of foundation for what it is that everybody in society is learning. This is a cool, Alan Bloom's defined culture this way, which I think, if you're talking about cultural literacy, makes the idea of cultural literacy even more beautiful. Alan Bloom said, culture refers to art, music, literature, educational television, certain kinds of movies, in short, everything that is uplifting and edifying, as opposed to commerce. The link is that culture is what makes possible on a high level the rich social life that constitutes a people, their customs, styles, tastes, festivals, rituals, gods, all that binds individuals into a group with roots, a community in which they can think together. Now, what's interesting about this is how things used to be done in America, right? So you go back to our educational history, and you find out that up until actually 1899, when Harvard unified their, when they came up with the elective system, up until that time, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, pretty much all the big name colleges had the same courses for all 4 years. The first 2.5 years of the elite Ivy League education dated back 1,000 years. And what that meant was that everybody could talk to everybody. It was sometimes a little dry and boring when you had to memorize your Latin and Greek, but ultimately you had this shared knowledge, this set of books that everyone that was educated had read and could discuss. And then as the elective system was put into place and we moved away from that tradition, historian Hugh Moorhead lamented. He said, college students could no longer hold conversations with their fellow classmates on anything held in common other than 1 or 2 textbooks. Yet in the beginning of the 19th century, everyone took the same classes, had the same books, many of them great. Both good literature and good conversation, the two complementing one another, flourished. You ask yourself today why, if you get into a group of people, any mixed group, not a group like this where we have shared common interests, but any generalized group, you go to dinner with a variety of people, there are really very few topics of conversation that can actually go on. That's why people talk about movies so much. It's one of the few things we share as a culture, that we like, that we're interested in, that we remember and can quote, right? And we're good at that at my house too. I mean, my kids can quote a lot of them. And kind of along that vein, even at the elementary level, there was this shared cultural background. In little town on the prairie, Laura Ingalls talks about this 4th of July celebration. And back then, when you went into town for the 4th of July celebration, the first and most important thing that happened was someone had to stand up in the middle of town and read the Declaration of Independence in its entirety. All the grievances, you got the whole thing. So Laura says she's standing there with her sister, and she makes this comment in the book. Laura and Carrie knew the Declaration by heart, of course, but it gave them a solemn, glorious feeling to hear the words. They took hold of hands and stood listening in the solemnly listening crowd. The stars and stripes were fluttering bright against the thin, clear blue overhead, and their minds were saying the words before their ears heard them. Actually, if you've ever read the book, she goes on over the next few pages to make this beautiful connection about the meaning of the Declaration and the meaning of her life and freedom and duty and responsibility. That's just amazing. But it was this cultural literacy. And the idea is a marvelous one. And if you go all the way back, you start at Plato, come all the way through the Western tradition, it's an idea that most of the great thinkers talk about and agree with, even on both sides. C.S. Lewis says we need an intimate knowledge of the past, not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future. And we need something to set against the present to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much which seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. That's one of the reasons why some of these myths that we've talked about today happen, because people are culturally illiterate, and what is ever is fashionable right now is all they're aware of. They don't have an understanding of the past enough to be able to bounce it off of what's currently popular. Robert Maynard Hutchins said, "It's impossible to have social order without intellectual order." That's an interesting idea. We talk a lot about religious order helping and aiding social order, but think about shared intellectual order also helping social order. Each individual's mind being trained and reasonable and able to think clearly, but also a society that shares a common idea, common goals, common values. Alan Bloom says, man grows and grows into culture. Cultures are, as is obvious from the word, growths. Man is a culture being, not a natural being. What man has from nature is nothing compared to what he has acquired from culture. And that's kind of an interesting thing to say now, all these years after Rousseau, when he said nature was everything, and now he's saying, actually, we got a few things from nature, but mostly what we love about our lives we got from culture. Plato said, true education will have the greatest tendency to civilize and humanize them in their relations to one another. I think that's interesting, ties kind of back to what Anelity was talking about, loving each other, humanizing us, helping us to get along. Even Plato said real education would bring about that end. Now, it's interesting that this idea of cultural literacy as a true principle and a core foundational idea to education, and so many people agreeing with it, and even us agreeing with it, as a true principle, was also the catalyst for Common Core. It was this book that is credited with the foundation of the Common Core movement. And when I found that out, I could not believe it. But really, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Because a lot of good people, and we're talking about 48 states have adopted it, right? That's a lot of people that had to go along with something. And a lot of the reason that they could, I believe, is because the principle behind the idea was a true one. The idea resonated with people. They thought, yes, I can get behind this. It is a good idea to give our kids cultural literacy. That is a great idea. So the question is then, what went wrong? If Common Core started out as a good idea, even a principle-centered idea, what went wrong? What are some of the things, you can just shout them out, that you don't like about Common Core? What are you against about Common Core? Central control?
Yeah, central control.
The culture they picked. Good. Any other, I mean, many of you have actively fought Common Core. What do you hate about it?
They test skills over knowledge.
Skills over knowledge.
Contempt for parents.
Contempt for parents.
Anti-God, anti-family.
Yeah.
It's not the culture we want.
Yeah. It's interesting because at the back of, I don't know how many people have read Cultural Literacy, the whole back is a little like encyclopedia. It's a big, long list of words and events and people that he felt like he ought to know. And the idea of his Core Knowledge Foundation is now been implemented in 1,260 schools. And what's fascinating about that is that 42% of them are public schools. So here you have Common Core being implemented side by side with common knowledge. And the result of the implementation, when you've got Hirsch implementing it, it looks like one thing, and when you've got the nation coming together and implementing it, it looks like something entirely different, which is really quite interesting. So what went wrong was not the idea then. What went wrong was the application of the principle. And maybe even more than being passionate about education, which I do love, I'm mostly passionate about principles. Because I'll never forget the day that we were reading stuff years ago in one of my classes, and we started reading about the idea of natural law. And for me, this was a whole new frame of reference. It was a brand new place of thinking. That, you go back to the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and nature's God. So this is an idea that goes back a long, long way, definitely an idea that the founders firmly believed in. And the idea is very simple. There's a God, he made man, and when he did that, he made laws that governed their human interactions and behavior. He knew what would make us happy, and he knew what would make us unhappy. And so he put natural laws from which we distill principles. And if we can identify those principles and live closer in accordance with them, we will increase our happiness. It's a simple equation. William Blackstone, who wrote Commentaries on the Laws of England, talked about this. And he had the whole first section it was in the 1760s, and that was the law book in America for 100 years, and all the founders read it, and the wording in his book kind of went into the Declaration and some of the founding documents. But he said, basically, God's so smart, he interwove natural laws with human happiness. And he made it so that to the extent that man lives natural laws, he will be happy, and to the extent that he doesn't, he'll be unhappy. So if we've got a true principle, and we're seeking to implement it like this cultural literacy principle, and you go wrong in the application, why does that happen? Because it happens all the time. Let's say, for example, that you get turned on to the idea of philanthropy. That's fantastic. You should give money. I'm going to give money to people. I am in love with that idea. It makes me feel wonderful. It makes them feel wonderful. I know it's a true principle. It resonates in my heart. I can't remember his name right at this moment, but he wrote an incredible treatise he's part of the Scottish Enlightenment. But anyway, he talked all about how natural laws have been written by God on the hearts of men. It's a cue for us, right? So when we hear something that's true, we'll know, so that he can speak to us, right? So he can guide us, so he can help us know. So you have these natural laws, and you work to implement them. So you're excited about philanthropy, so you decide you're going to be a philanthropist. So you do it, right? You start giving money away, and you find really good causes, and you do all your research, and you're helping a lot of people, and your life is so rich until the moment when your money runs out. Because you realize that you've lived a true principle and been rewarded for it. You've had a great experience, but you lived it at the expense of other true principles. So if you try to take a natural law or a true principle and isolate it, then that's when things can run amok, even if you're right. It's kind of like this idea in this presentation about what C.S. Lewis was saying, that you can have the people with the best intentions often do the greatest harm because they have clear consciences, because they're triumphing an idea, because they really believe that this isolated principle is true, but they're walking over and stepping on other true principles that make the application of it often do more damage than good. The real philanthropist who ignores savings, paying off his debts, fulfilling his obligations financially, will eventually find that he's on the other end of the coin. And the one principle he set out to triumph, he will now be a victim of, and he will need aid from others. So you cannot, in any educational endeavor, set out to solve problems by isolating something that feels true to you. Here's another quick example. So Maria Montessori, I'm sure you've all heard her name. She was brilliant. She's in Italy, and there's a man named Giuseppe Sergei. I think that's how you say his name. And he's going along in Italy in the late 1800s. And he's got kind of a similar idea to this idea. She said about him that for more than 30 years he had earnestly labored to spread among the teachers of Italy the principles of not education, the principles of a new civilization based upon education. Because how else are you going to get it, right? You don't get the kids young and train them on whatever type of civilization you're going for. You can't get there. It's a necessary medium for good or for ill. So he's going along, and he's been teaching all the teachers this, and everybody in Italy is on fire, and they're ready for an educational revolution. And Maria Montessori is part of this, and she's read his stuff, and she thinks he's marvelous. And in her book, The Montessori Method, she talks about what came out of it. So the scientists in Italy get super excited, and they run into the schools ready to solve the educational problems of their day, and they notice that the benches that the students sit on are causing back problems later in life. And so she says, then came science and perfected the bench. In this work, much attention was paid to the recent contributions of anthropology. The age of the child and the length of his limbs were considered in placing the seat at the right height. The distance between the seat and the desk was calculated with infinite care in order that the child's back should not be deformed. And finally, the seats were separated and the width so closely calculated that the child could barely seat himself upon it while he stretched himself by making any lateral movements impossible. So I don't know if any of you ever read the Montessori Method, but she's got like 3 pages on this. She's super ticked off. And she just keeps going on about this bench. She's so angry about it because in answer to this clarion call to save the children and save Italy, everybody made new desks. And she goes on to kind of finish this section by saying, the conquest of liberty is what the school needs, not the mechanism of a bench. So not only did it not solve the problem, the one thing she would have liked to see for more liberty for the children, they're even more confined now in their new desks. And if you know anything about the implementation of the Montessori method, you know that she freed children from their desks. They don't even have desks. They roam from activity to activity, kind of sit at round tables in chairs their own size. And so this is the kind of thing that happens when we get a great idea educationally and we run out there to solve the world's problems. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about today, and I think it's Wendy kind of alluded to it, is the education of the educators themselves. It is so true that we can't give what we don't have. And so if the people making the decisions don't understand, if they aren't culturally illiterate, if they don't know what's gone on before, how are they going to make better decisions for the next generation? Now, the thing that's cool about principles is that they can be honored in so many ways. One of the things that I loved about the American family education, and we, Oak did the same thing with agency-based education, was before they set out to solve problems, they took the time to identify their principles. Because the founding principles in any endeavor are the checkpoints, right? So you can go, if you go into any educational approach, you have a great idea. It's the other principles that keep you grounded. You've got a great idea, sure, you're the philanthropist that wants to save the world. But have you checked in on your savings account? And have you paid off your own debts? And have you, even better yet, have you created a residual income source that could fund your philanthropic ideas forever? And so if you have that baseline, that checkpoint, if something like that had been in place, if there had been more conversation locally, statewide, internationally, about the other principles that were at play when Common Core was being implemented, it would have never made it as far as it made it, or it would have had to take an entirely different form. Because you're absolutely right. It walked on all kinds of other principles like parental rights, individual rights, states' rights. Even Anelity and I were talking for a minute too about, it's so crazy how we've moved away from a religious society. That used to be our common culture. Now we believe in science. It's kind of funny to say, but it really is true. If you want to prove something in public, cite a study, and then everyone will believe you. So since we believe in science, it's kind of crazy how so often we ignore it when it's most important. And frankly, we ignore it all the time in education. We know that children learn languages best before the age of 12. We know that boys and girls learn subjects at a different rate at different ages. We know that their sight is different, their hearing is different. We know all kinds of incredible science that would aid us in our classrooms, but we don't care. We ignore the very thing that could really help us because, again, we are not interested in getting clear on principles and having a principle-centered approach. We're interested in agendas or money or whatever it else is that's guiding us. And what's cool is that being principle-centered can start with you. It can start with me, and it can start right here. There are a lot of educational principles, I guess, that I could cite. I want to take you through just a few that are so broadly accepted, they can kind of serve as a baseline. The American family education is a model with certain principles, and if you identify with those principles, you can get involved in that educational form, right? Here's some that most great thinkers, as I've read through the great educational thinkers in history, here's a few that they seem to agree on. Cultural awareness, which we've already touched on. Age-appropriate learning. Age and gender, you could say. That you should honor child development in your educational programs. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, "Teach it as you please so long as it is nothing but play." And he was talking about the elementary ages. Educate for lifelong learning. Mortimer J. Adler said, "If your education so far has given you a superficial introduction to the whole world of learning, if it has given you the skills you need to go on learning, skills that also help you to use your mind creatively, and if it has inspired you with a zest to use these skills to the utmost of your ability, then it has done as much for you as you have any right to expect." Everyone seems to agree, all educational philosophers, liberal or conservative, agree that learning should go on for a lifetime, and that education's one of its major roles should be to help people be lifelong learners. We should educate for self-preservation and broad literacy. That develops a middle class. That's just socially necessary. Education should come from within. It should be self-guided. Rousseau said, "Do not forget that it is rarely your business as the teacher to suggest what he ought to learn. It is for him to want to learn, to seek and to find it. You must put it within his reach. You must skillfully awaken the desire and supply him with the means for his satisfaction." And of course, everybody really across the board says that education should build character. That individuals should be better people, that front cortex, right? They should be better people for what they have learned. Plato, I don't know if any of you have ever read Republic, but in there's some not great stuff. But one of the interesting things that Plato talks about is that the elementary school kids should not, that age group should not be reading Homer. because he gives people a distorted idea about the nature of God and gods. And so it's going to distort the value system of the younger children. It's really kind of interesting. So I want to give you three things that we can all do, three, I guess, actions that we can take that will really help us to be more principle-centered in our educational approaches. Number one, and these are probably all obvious, because principles are what they are, they're much easier to live at a local level. The more someone else is in control of what's happening in anything, really, but in education in this case, the more difficult it is. That's why our founders talked so much about freedom of conscience. They were sick of the king telling them they had to keep importing slaves. It was contrary to their conscience. They wanted to get rid of slavery over time. So we need freedom of conscience, and the only way that we can live according to true principles is to make everything as local as possible. So there are exceptions, I'm sure, now and again, but any measure that you can see that puts more power locally, whether it brings it to a state, a local school board, or especially to the parents, is almost always going to be a good idea. Obviously, the second thing that we can do is more awareness of principles. We can look for them ourselves, we can study them, we can strive to live more principle-centered lives, we can strive to honor educational principles as much as humanly possible within the choices that we make. And the third one is something, I want to tell you what Noah Webster said. Our constitutions of civil government are not yet firmly established. Our national character is not yet formed, and it is an object of vast magnitude that systems of education should be adopted and pursued, which implant in the minds of the American youth the principles of virtue and liberty, and inspire them with just and liberal ideas of government, and with an inviolable attachment to their country. It just goes without saying that principles of liberty are the foundation of everything else. That if we don't raise a generation that understands what rights are and what natural laws are and what principles are, they won't even know that things ought to be different, let alone know how to make them different. And having the liberty to educate in a principle-centered manner can only happen in an environment of great liberty. So to learn the principles of liberty, to train our youth up on the principles of liberty, is the very best thing we can do for ourselves and our families and for our country. Thanks.